Okay, welcome to Power Pivots, the podcast where we explore the stories behind the fundamental career shifts and changes that make all the difference. I'm your host. I go by Hatu, and today we are joined by
Austin Taylor. Thanks for having me, Hatu.
my man. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm really excited to have you.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, let's just jump in. So I like to start the show by asking people about their PowerPoints. And essentially, PowerPoints are three facts about you, three like words or phrases that help us understand who you are. So for you, what are your PowerPoints, Austin?
My PowerPoints, the top three I think that come up a lot, either how I view myself or how people have talked about me, are definitely level-headed. I'd also say focused is probably one of them. And we'll throw empathetic in there too.
Okay. All right. Cool. And I guess emphasize a little bit more, just explain a little bit more about why you think those fit you.
Sure, yeah. So I've come from an athletic background, very competitive. I played a lot of sports as a kid, but predominantly football as I got older. And I think in those situations, they're high pressure, high energy. You don't want to get lost in the chaos. So having that competitive fire, but having it be focused and being able to be calm while channeling that that energy, I see a lot of benefit in my career now. So I think that's a lot of it. But the empathetic part, as you're going through, whether you're doing presentations or, I guess in games specifically, which we'll talk about later, viewing the player perspective, you have to be able to put yourself in someone's shoes and understand what it is they care about so that you can deliver a good product or even just connect with them and understand what they're upset about or happy about.
Right. Right. Oh, no. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay. Very good. Very good. So we always hear that the story is told in hindsight and hindsight is 2020. So from hindsight right now, tell me your hindsight story.
Yeah. So I alluded to it a little bit. I played a lot of sports growing up and, obviously was studying hard. And when I got to high school, I knew I wanted to go to good academic school. And it just so happened that football helped take me to the next level in terms of getting noticed by some of these colleges, and it opened the door to the Ivy League for me. So I ended up going to Harvard, playing football.
College.
Yes, sir. Yeah, big H. Dropping the H-bomb early. So, that was a huge, blessing, however you want to call it. My family was just over the moon that was the caliber of school that, a lot of people dream about going to. So being able to land that really set me up for a lot of the successes down the road. So I, studied statistics, stayed focused on my grades and not just sports. And upon graduation, I knew I wanted to go into some sort of analytical field. I think a lot of us want to have everything figured out right away. And it's like, all right, I can be an analyst somewhere, and then eventually I can make a path and eventually power pivot, as we're going to talk about. Yeah. So my first job out of school was working for Hewlett Packard. I think a lot of people think of the laptops or printers. I was in their server division doing product strategy. And it wasn't quite what I wanted to do. It was good work and it was an amazing opportunity, but it wasn't quite aligned with some of my passions. So I think a lot of folks start to think about their next career jump. A lot of us, I'd say millennials or people our age will stay in careers shorter than our parents did. So even for me, this was, I think, about a year in, I was already looking at changes. And I happened to have a friend from undergrad who worked at the Boston Consulting Group recruit me to the Dallas office. So did that. And as a consultant, I worked in a lot of industries, grocery, clothing, traditional retail, tech, media, telecom, kind of the jack of all trades. And it really helped hone some of the more generalist skills, things like building Excel models, building PowerPoint slides, those communication skills, just like really getting fast and sharp at those. And then over the course of a year and a half, I started feeling that burnout. Frankly, it got to the point, and this is, if we're getting into the pivot part of it, my performance started suffering. I wasn't happy, working a lot of long weeks, long nights. And it got to the point where one of the talent managers was like, maybe consulting's not for you. And I think it's a blow to the ego to think, oh, I'm doing something and someone's telling me I'm not good at it or I'm not the right fit, despite, all the work that I put in and all the things I did to get to that point.
How far into your career at BCG were you at this point?
This was about a year and a half in. And
Oh
for
wow,
folks who
okay.
aren't familiar with management consulting, there's kind of this unspoken up or out type of culture where around the 2 year mark, you either go to business school and then come back and you're promoted to consultant or whatever the terminology is, or you stay and you get promoted, or you start looking to pivot into industry. Talking about networks, a lot of these consulting firms are partnered with all sorts and sizes of companies across the US or even around the world. And because of those relationships, sometimes you go work for one of those companies after the fact. If
Mhm.
making something up, let's say you go work for Under Armour, right? And you get to see what that company's run like, you get to work in a certain division, and maybe you decide it's like, oh, this is a good exit opportunity for me. That happens
Mhm.
all the time with consultants. So at this 1.5 year mark, I was thinking about business school. I was thinking about exit opportunities, and it got accelerated because this performance conversation. But I definitely I felt sorry for myself for a little bit, but then I was like, let me pick up these pieces and really get to where I want to be. I felt like it was a time where I had a lot of agency. I'd done a lot of the right things. I had Harvard on the resume. Now I have Boston Consulting Group on the resume. Let me see where I can write my ticket. So in that moment, the core pillar of my job search was I want to work somewhere where I believe in the product and I'm passionate about it. And so the two big buckets that came down to were gaming and fitness. So I had tabbed companies like Nike, Fitbit, Under Armour, Rogue, the people who make barbells. Like, let me just see what I
Mhm.
can do here. And
Oh
in
wow.
gaming, of course, we all know the big names of Blizzard, Activision, Rockstar, Bethesda, even. And so I'm curating my lists and everything, and ultimately I benefited from my network again. There was another
Mhm.
consultant who was looking to leave, had been through the interview process with Blizzard, and he ended up getting an offer at a different company. So he left the process, but gave them my name and said, hey, you're the other gamer in the office, I think you'd be great at this role. And that's how I got my foot in the industry working at Blizzard back in 2017.
Oh wow. Awesome. That's dope. That is dope. There's so many different things that I got from that story that are just helpful, right? First of all, your ability to understand heteronormativity and want to continue down that path of statistics is beyond me. Anytime I take a statistics class, I'm like, I could never do this. So kudos to you on that.
Thank
Kudos to
you.
you. But on a serious note, though, the aspect of just being able to utilize your network, right? I think a lot of times folks will see some of these schools or some of these companies and they'll view them as like, they're good just because I recognize them or for brand recognition. But a lot of it is networking, right? Because truth be told, being there is not easy, right? And there are easier options that you could have pursued, maybe like more pleasurable options, but being able to utilize that afterwards to either go up or go out, like you
Yeah.
mentioned, is definitely a big thing.
Yeah, I feel like networking is always like a bit of a touchy subject. I'm
Mhm.
sure we all know the LinkedIn experience where you encounter someone who just adds everybody on LinkedIn and it
Correct.
feels a bit inauthentic or more of a chore than anything. And I definitely fall in that camp. Like I'm probably less proactive about networking than a lot of people would assume about me. And part of that's privilege, right? Like I've been in spaces where the network is very powerful. Like some of my
Correct.
undergraduate classmates from Harvard have gone on to do amazing things, and I just know them as someone I would have beers with on a Saturday, right?
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So it's like, yeah, I didn't have to do a lot of the hard work that someone from a lesser known part of the world or a less prestigious company, they might have to grind a little bit harder to be intentional about those relationships. What I will
Right.
say is there's a level of authenticity I always want to feel when I am networking with someone. And to use
Mhm.
the BCG example, I just let people know like I'm pretty nerdy. Like I love playing video games. I talked about
Mhm.
building computers on the weekends. And so because of that, someone knows this is who Austin is. This is what he's
Yeah.
about and what actually he's passionate about. So of course he's going to be at the top of my list when I talk to Blizzard. Like I'm not just going
Right.
to throw that away because this is also my friend and it's someone that I connected with. So I
Right.
think that's like the biggest piece of networking is show people
Yeah.
who you are and then the rest kind of falls into place.
Yeah. And you that leads perfectly actually into my next point is just letting the passion drive you, right? I have so many of these conversations and it seems like when folks are able to get to the point where their passion drives them in the career direction, that's when things really start to hum. Right.
Yeah.
Before it's like a mismatch and it's a mismatch, but it's like, hey man, listen, I got to pay rent. Like
Yeah.
I got to just grind it out.
Yeah.
You don't have that luxury. But then when you're able to find out how you can make what pays your bills align with what you're passionate about, that's when things really start to go well.
Yeah, that's always a double-edged sword too, where,
Mm-hmm.
like with games, I go to work and I'm working on games and I go home and I want to play games.
Yeah,
And,
yeah,
as that line blurs, if I have a bad day at work, does that mean I'm going to have a bad day at home too? Because now
yeah.
League of
That's
Legends
true.
is making me feel some type of way. So
Mm-hmm.
there's a level of like separation of church and state I try and preserve,
Yeah,
so that, it does, like, games as work and games as a passion still has like a thin divider.
yeah,
But I do like to leverage that passion to amplify my work, is the way I like to
yeah.
think about it.
No, that makes a lot of sense. That's really helpful. Well, I wanted to talk a little bit more about your pivot. I like to usually approach this from a what was it, why did you do it, and like how did you do it standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
But you have an interesting case here because you've done a few different pivots
Mm-hmm.
from an industry standpoint and then an industry and function standpoint. So I guess if you want to talk about those, like just tell me a little bit more about like kind of like what those were, why you made the certain changes, and then how you did them.
Yeah, I think looking at the industry pivot, so going from consulting into gaming, I think a lot of it was just like building up the skill set and then making my way once inside the industry, figuring out how to apply those skills. So being able to model things very rapidly in Excel, build compelling presentations, knowing how to tailor how I communicate to a specific audience, that is useful everywhere. Kind of like statistics, like being a good analyst, I can analyze groceries, for Kroger and like, their stock fulfillment, or I could look at player data like I do on League of Legends. So,
Mm-hmm.
building up like my toolkit and then being able to show like, hey, this is the value I bring to your company really made that pivot easy. If we think about, I'm sure people have seen Wolf of Wall Street where the guy's like,
Of
sell me
course.
this pen. Like that's the skill
Yeah.
set, like being able to
Yeah.
apply it to anything. So that really helped a lot. Once inside the industry, I think some of it is just kind of out of your own control. Businesses change and evolve over time. Their needs change and evolve over time. So, when I got into Blizzard, it was for a finance role. Historically, they had been just like kind of generic finance. If you think about managing a P&L, doing
Mm-hmm.
forecasting, things like that. But they had a new emerging business need of wanting to have more product oriented finance. So like very revenue focused.
Right.
But if you think about, hey, we could sell you this car in a game for $10. It's like, okay, yeah, we could do that. But is that the right price point? Are we launching this at the right time? Should it be bundled with something else? Like they weren't asking those questions at that
Right.
time. So they wanted to bring in more analysts to help justify some of these business decisions so that games like World of Warcraft that have been around for over a decade, closer to two at this point, they can continue to do so because it's just more and more competitive over time. So because of these evolving business needs, I went from being just, I do air quotes here, just a
Yeah.
financial analyst to kind of like a product strategist. And, as World of Warcraft launches expansions, like I get to go through that life cycle and, kind of
Right.
hang my hat on these things. And then I moved over to Overwatch, which was slightly more product focused, still revenue oriented, but kind of a different side of the coin. And so going through that on a different game, building out my skill set further, you just get these accolades. And that's when kind of within the industry, my next big pivot happened where Riot came knocking. And, it was literally a LinkedIn message saying, hey, we have this, revenue strategy role that we're opening. Your skill set looks applicable. So again, like the toolkit is there. And they had the accolades because, at this point on my LinkedIn and resume, it's Harvard, Boston Consulting Group, Blizzard, which had World of Warcraft and Overwatch. All these big names are starting to jump out where
Yeah.
as a recruiter, I'm sure that they're just like looking for some of these buzzwords, looking for these people
Sure
who've
are.
had these big bets and
Yep.
won. So once I got to Riot, it kind of did that same process of came in as a revenue strategist, and as our product needs evolved over time, and the League of Legends is now above this decade old mark,
Mm-hmm.
they moved me from strategic advisory is what we called it into the production department. So now I'm
Yep.
going from purely financial, P&L focus to what is the player experience? Like, how are we delivering these products? And yeah, they have revenue implications, but actually being focused on the building aspect of it. So, I don't want to be stagnant. I have to learn these new skill sets as I go. But it's less of, hey, I want to be a producer, to, oh, right, it needs me to be a producer and I need to rise to that need.
Right, right. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I think my biggest question there is, you've mentioned how people obviously have like signaling theory based on the stuff that you've done of what your skill set is or what it should be, right? For
Mm-hmm.
someone who may not have that, what would you say are some resources that you can think of that could help them with building out that ability to model, right? Or that ability
Mm.
to be able to say like, hey, listen, I understand how to like manage a P&L. What are some of the transferable skills that you think that people could really lean on if they're looking to do something similar, or some resources that they could use to build out that skill set?
Yeah, I think part of it is just like learning opportunities where that doesn't exist in your current role. When I was at Hewlett Packard, I did this a lot where they expressed the need of, hey, we have this product portfolio and we need to figure out how certain products map to certain customers. So if you think, hey, this type of server is good for at home use, and this type of server is good for like a big Fortune 500 company, and there's like everything in between, we need to enable a sales rep to figure out what that is. So rather than just writing a Word doc or like talking to people, I wanted to say like, oh, this is something that we can document and use over time. So I built an Excel model, just like, part of it was Googling. It's like, how do I
Yeah,
do this drop down window? And it's like, okay, there's plenty of resources on the internet, on YouTube
right.
and whatever, to say, okay, if you want to make this a short list of like A, B, C, here's what you do. So I started like doing that and thinking of what, again, like that empathy part that I talked about at the beginning,
Right.
understanding what my customers' needs were. In this case, it was people within the company, and trying to, as I say, future proof it. So how do I make a piece of documentation that meets needs and will be long lasting and is flexible enough, but also dummy proof? Like, I don't want someone to
Yeah.
break this thing after I leave it.
Yeah.
So I think it's just the way you identify it can vary, but I think it's just like that willingness to step into a space where no one else is kind of creating or innovating there. And the resource part is, we're fortunate where everybody's doing really cool stuff like on the internet. I've watched tons of YouTube videos for how I do parts of my job, and I think a lot of
Yeah.
engineers can relate.
Yeah.
Engineers is like, all right, I need to write this block of code, but
Yeah.
I'm getting this error, and someone's like, oh yeah, I fixed that like 6 months ago. And it's like, yeah,
Yeah.
like that's great. You don't have to be this 100% encyclopedia of knowledge. Like, we're all like kind of drawing inspiration from stuff, and it applies creatively too. So don't be scared to just like hit that Google search sometimes, and like, yeah, like 9 times out of 10 you might not find it, but that one time you do, pull on that thread and see how far it takes you.
Yeah, I think what you just said there is super, super critical, because I think a lot of times folks will focus on, hey, being at company X or being in position Y is what's important, but it's really about the skill set, right? At this point in time, and YouTube and just Googling, like going on forums and things of that nature, is a lot of times, like even when you're in those positions, how you learn how to do the job, right? Like getting hired for the job doesn't always necessarily mean that you know how to do everything that they want you to do, but
Mm-hmm.
being able to be resourceful enough to figure out like, hey, this is what I need to do my job, and finding those answers, that's what makes a big difference, right? Being able to really jump on that opportunity when it's given to you.
Yeah.
Has Power Pivots inspired you to reevaluate your career path? If so, look into Power Pivots Career Coaching. Whether you're interested in career discovery, job description dissection, or interview prep, I take a tailored approach to helping you understand your ultimate career goals and get closer to them. Interested? Fill out the interest form at the bottom of the show notes for your free 30-minute consultation. For any questions, email hatu@powerpivots.co. That's HATU at powerpivots.co. As always, pivot powerfully.
Cool. And then for you, what would you say has made your power pivot so crucial?
We talked about the passion part a lot
Hmm.
early on. I wanted to work in games. And, I thought about going to business school. And once I got into games, I said, no, I don't need that anymore. So really just doubling down on it, I guess, is a piece of
Yeah.
it. But it's also being honest with myself and being really, I guess, loyal to myself too. So when Riot had messaged me about, hey, do you want this role? I voiced my concerns. I said,
Yeah.
hey, this is what I'm happy and unhappy with in my current role. What's
Right.
going to be different about this role? And
Mm.
I think that falls under this umbrella of when you're applying to a job or interviewing at a job, making sure that you are advocating for yourself. Because if you
Hmm.
really think simplistically about it, you are a stranger talking to another stranger, and all that they have to go off of is a piece of paper. So being able to say, I need to brag on myself, because it's not bragging if it's true. Like, I need
Yeah.
to be
Yeah.
able to point to all of these things. And then once they see all the accolades, they're interviewing you just as much as you're interviewing them. So they're trying to say, hey, Riot is a great company. You should come work here. Here's all the cool stuff. And then
Mm-hmm.
you're telling them, hey, I'm Austin Taylor, and here's why you want to hire me, and here's all the cool stuff. But then you also need to pick at, well, hey, Austin, we need to know, like, how good are your math skills? And they're going to put you through these tests. So why shouldn't you feel like, hey, I'm very passionate about diversity. Like, what do you got going on in that space? Like, there needs to be that, I guess, call it boldness almost, to say, like, no,
Yeah.
like, I need my needs met because I know you need headcount. Like, I know that, like,
Yeah.
now
Yeah.
being on the
Yeah.
other side and like being in
Yeah.
production, it's like we just don't have enough people to do certain stuff. So it's like, yeah, we
Hmm.
need to hire somebody, and that person needs to understand like their worth in that scenario of, they want me for a reason. So let me make sure I get what I need out of this too.
Hmm. Hmm. Absolutely. And, for me, as someone who's a recruiter, the biggest questions I always ask people are, why are you leaving your current role? And then what are you looking for in your next one? So
Yeah.
having that nailed down with the passion and knowing exactly what you've liked and disliked about where you are or have been really helps that conversation a lot. When I talk to
Mm-hmm.
people and they're like, I don't know, I'm like, I'm not convinced either. Right. But
Yeah.
if you tell me like, hey, listen, I like this, I like this, I don't like this. By the way, I see that you guys are doing that, so I think it could be a great fit. Then I'm like, tell me more. And then the
Yeah.
other aspect of what you said also is like that boldness is super important, because a lot of times, obviously, you have to do it with discretion, but folks who come in there and are willing to advocate for themselves and really talk about their accomplishments and what they can do end up really putting themselves leagues ahead
Mm-hmm.
of folks who are like a little more like timid, or like telling you like, oh, that's on my resume, right? Like, you can see it on my resume. Well, no, tell me about it. We're having
Yeah.
this conversation. I've read over your resume, and frankly, on average, we read over them in 7 seconds, right?
Yeah.
So tell me more, like help me understand it, right? Bring it to life. So no, those are definitely really helpful points, from not just from a pivot standpoint, but from a like recruiting standpoint overall.
Yeah. Yeah. I think,
So,
to get really specific about pivots, it is that malleability and like curiosity, I guess, is probably a piece of it. You don't want to fixate on where you are. Like, you're never going to be the best analyst of all time. Like, there's always room for
mm,
growth and stuff. But I just had this conversation with a manager recently where he's like, you are really good at this specific skill set. I
mm,
don't want you to burn out. I don't want you to feel like you're plateauing or getting diminishing returns. So, like, if we can get you exposure to this adjacent skill set, not only does that make your base skills better, but like, you are now more valuable because we can put you more places. If to use a sports metaphor, like, you're the utility
yeah,
player. It's like, we can put you at wide
yeah,
receiver, but we can put you at quarterback because you can throw and run and do all this stuff.
yeah,
Like, that just
yeah,
makes your personal brand, like, people know you as someone who can do all this stuff, and your value because you're actually doing it. Like,
yeah,
there's that, if you're willing to be a team player and flex a little bit, it will be uncomfortable. But I
hmm,
think if you're operating from a foundation of trust where they're only going to put you somewhere where they want you to succeed, it's like, great, okay, I have this like grace period to like get up to speed and learn how to do advanced calculus if that's what the need is. But they
hmm,
know that, like, over time I will get there, and if I'm not,
yeah,
like, they're invested in my success, so I need to raise my hand, ask for help, do all those things. So I think that's part of pivoting too, is recognizing it's not going to be easy at first, because
Yeah.
that's the point of a pivot. You are changing something, but through that change comes growth.
Absolutely, absolutely. Wow, you said so many great things here. I'm loving it. I'm loving it. It's great. But for you, what would you say if you had to give yourself advice from a pre-pivot standpoint and a post-pivot standpoint? What advice would you give yourself?
Yeah, I think looking back, it's like be a better advocate for yourself. I think a lot of times, like, you have faith in the systems that are in place, whether it's like, HR review process, promotion windows, and things like that. But I don't think that early enough I raised my hand to say, hey, I'm not getting my needs met, in terms of professional development and things like that. So now, like, I love doing stuff like this, where I can say the times where I was bold and the times I was, quite frankly, a little bit arrogant, because I
Yeah.
know that, like, that sets off the right alarm bells whenever things were really bad. And I'm thinking specifically of like some of the days in consulting where I'm working 90-hour weeks and staying up until 4 a.m. working on PowerPoint slides. Like, this shouldn't feel normal. Like, this shouldn't be
Yeah.
okay. And if it is, if that's the expectation, we can have that talk and navigate it. But I wasn't even doing that. So
Yeah.
I think that's probably the big one for me. But I think, looking at, some of the growth beyond then, it's a matter of just like being intentional about where I want to go. I'm still really struggling with, like, what my long-term career looks like. I've made all of these like steps along the way, but I know we all get met with the, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Or where do you see, like, what's your end goal? What's your forever role?
Yeah.
And so many times I just answer, I don't know. And, I'm not expecting to have a specific answer of like, oh, I want to be the CFO. Like, I don't think that's necessarily what I want to do, but figuring out the elements of the things that I like and having the conversations with people who can help guide me there. It's like, oh, I really
Right.
like the product aspect of my role. I like making stuff. I like
Mm.
thinking as a player. It's like, okay, well, now that you said that, the roles went from like 5,000 things to 500 things. Okay, how do we keep chipping away? So now I have like a more focused effort on the trajectory of my career versus just, like you said, well, I don't know, like, read my resume and you tell me. It's like, no, I want to be an active participant in that.
That's absolutely advocating for yourself, and then also making sure that you're an active participant in your own career journey is so critical. And whenever I talk to friends and they ask me about career advice, by default, obviously, like, that's what I tell them. I'm just like, what do you want? Like, it's about you. Your career is about you. You have to be selfish about it to a certain extent. Like, what do you want? When you're doing something and you're like, oh, I love this. And you also know when you're doing something, you're like, I can't stand this at all whatsoever.
Yeah.
So, being able to be honest with yourself, if you have to write those things down and go back and look at it on a monthly, quarterly basis, then do that. But when you're trying to put the story together, it's clear when people have put some thought into what really speaks to them, as opposed to those who are kind of just being thrown left and right based on kind of where they're recruited to.
Yeah. Yeah. You definitely, like, there are some moments where you don't have the bandwidth to do that. And I understand, like, you feel like, a leaf just flowing down the river. And it's like, all right, I gotta pay the rent. I gotta do all these things. And eventually, like, it'll work out. But there will come a point where you have to, like, stop and, like, assess the situation. Be like, hey, 2 years have gone by. Is this where I want to be? Am I actually happy? Am I feeling fulfilled? Am I energized by these things? Or, like, are all those questions important to me? Do I need these things from work? Or am I okay with it just being a job? Because frankly, I'm very fortunate. I love games and I work in games. But some people, they might work for a company where it's like, yeah, it's just a job, and that's okay too. But it goes back to assessing, like, what those needs are and where they're being met.
Yeah, absolutely. So for you, speaking of games, I guess, what are your thoughts on the industry right now? Where do you see gaming right now? Where do you think it's going? Just some general insight from you.
Yeah, I feel like we're definitely at an inflection point of sorts for two very specific reasons. The first is generational turnover, as I like to think about it. So millennials were the first generation to basically grow up with games. Like, games were introduced, call it like 80s roughly. So that was like part way through our parents' generation. Like, oh yeah, like I have an Atari. It's like, cool, like this is new, but as an adult almost. For us, like we
Yeah.
grew up with the internet, we grew up with games. We don't really, like, we remember our early transition to that, but we don't really know a world that much without it. But now this next generation, called, Gen Z specifically, it's like we're teaching our kids games. Like we're putting that, like, I'm sure we've seen the videos of like a 3-year-old playing Fortnite on an iPad. And that's
Yeah.
normal.
Yeah.
So now with this second generation, being very familiar with the games and like, content creation, all this stuff, there's going to be an explosion in this like user base. And it's just going to be like cemented how important it is. It's not
Yeah.
as nascent as it was in the past. I think
Mhm.
because of that is my second point is there's a lot of money flowing into games.
Mm-hmm.
Before, people talk about the early League of Legends tournaments that were held in someone's basement or like in some, hotel lobby, whatever.
Yeah.
And now you see these like sold out stadiums all around the world for, whatever championship of whatever game that you play. So people notice that type of stuff, like private equity
Yeah.
firms, like all these investment firms, like getting esports teams or, helping, some of these new startup companies get off the ground. I think that part is still very early. So
Mhm.
I see like a lot of learning happen, like needing to happen instead of just like, oh, this game sounds cool. Here's $100 million. Like people will get more and more critical about what success metrics are and like how to identify winners and losers in the space. But for right now, I think people are kind of salivating at, Fortnite success, League of Legends success, and not just success in terms of like, wow, they made this much money in a year. It's they've been making this much money for a very long time.
Yeah.
I think one of the cool charts that I've seen in my time in the industry is if you look at a movie release, Creed 3 just came out, and you probably, if you could plot their revenue, like there's a huge spike opening weekend, and then it kind of just like dribbles out over time, and then it rotates out of theater, goes to streaming, whatever.
Yeah.
Games, they're almost the opposite, where like it might start slow and then it just kind of explodes, and then it just sustains, like it just stays high. If I'm thinking about specifically WoW and League with some of the older games in their respective spaces, they've just been making this much money for like
Yeah.
a decade straight, and that there's not many products like that. So that is extremely attractive to people outside the industry.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Now, that attractiveness to people outside the industry and the money flowing in, do you think that that could potentially have a negative effect on the production of games or like the future of how games are going, or do you think that it'll be fine?
I think it could have a positive effect.
Okay.
Speaking from a diversity angle, it could enable creators that typically wouldn't have had access to resources or opportunities, right? There are a lot of people who don't get a shot at Riot or Blizzard or some of these big AAA studios, so they opt to make their own thing. And if they make a hit, now someone's going to notice them and be like, hey, do you want to start a studio? Well, like, we'll get you 10 headcounts so you can make the next big thing. I hope that there's some sort of like responsible investment that starts happening. I think maybe some of these AAA studios, I know like Riot does some advising or investment in underrepresented creators. So I'm seeing the start of it. I just want to make sure that it does end up investing in products that mean a lot to people. I think
Right.
there's just with any new tech specifically, not just games, there's a desire to have that gold rush mentality. It's like, oh, this is a shooting star and I want to like make my money quick. Games aren't made that way. Like, especially the games that are built to last, if we're talking development cycles, we're looking at like 5 to 7 years before a game hits the market. And that's optimistic. We all know production challenges and delays and people leave and stuff. So
Mhm.
it's really hard to, I guess, make sure that people stay honest, like just trust, like this is going to take a lot of time and money and effort, but then the ROI on the back end is huge. I think that like where we get into trouble is no, like I want my money back sooner rather than later. So instead of 5 years, you need to ship in 2.5, and then you have a half baked game that people actually don't like, and it fails for all the wrong reasons.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, no, that's definitely good insight and definitely good context of like kind of like what's going on and what we have to look forward to in the industry. It's
Mm-hmm.
definitely exciting. I mean, for you personally, what are some things that you would say are exciting for you? Like, what are you looking forward to in the future?
What am I looking forward to in games? I think I really enjoy working on titles that are kind of like lifetime games.
Mm-hmm.
Even though I worked on World of Warcraft only for about a year, probably call it 2018 to 2019, and I don't work at Blizzard anymore, I'm still a WoW player. Like I have my
Mm-hmm.
community that I built up over the years and continue to raid every Tuesday with and look forward to all the patch notes coming out. So I think there's this sense of community around games that
Mm-hmm.
is really exciting, and because of I'll just say thank you Marvel to making it cool to be like nerdy and stuff. So games are kind of latching onto those tailwinds. You think about not just the games themselves, but like shows like Arcane and shows like The Last of Us. Like these are
Mm-hmm.
global hits, global phenomena. It's like, all right, the community is growing and leveling up and evolving. So being a gamer as part of your identity has much more variety in how it manifests rather than it just being this niche, like, oh, he's in his basement playing stuff. So
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
think that, kind of the social element of gaming really excites me. And I do think that, it leads to a lot of creativity within games themselves, why you play games, why you spend money
Right.
on games. If I'm able to signal like I'm a League of Legends player and I have some merch, like a poster on the wall or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And then, in the game, it's like, oh, like because I know I spend, 100 hours in a year playing this game, it actually makes
Mm-hmm.
sense to spend money here because I feel like I'm getting my value back. Like, working in
Yeah.
monetization like I do, that's the kind of core philosophy we try and hit on is it's not about how much you spend, it's when you do spend, are you excited with what you get back? And if that
Mm.
answer is no, we're doing something wrong and we need to improve. But I think for a lot of people, for whatever reason you monetize, if you want to show off, if you want to, show your pride in an esports team, or you want to show the effort that you put in order to earn like, some super cool skin, like
Mm-hmm.
being able to cater to those needs. Again, we're talking about meeting needs a lot,
Yeah.
understanding what those are for players and being able to say like, oh, like that guy is super cool. Like he hit, rank 1 last season and that's why he has the crazy title above his head.
Mm-hmm.
That is like a social element too. And like the better we get at that, the more exciting games themselves are. And that's what keeps people coming back.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah. No, that absolutely hit the nail on the head for sure. For you, what would you say are some like parting words of wisdom that you would give folks? Obviously, there are a lot of different avenues and angles that you could slice this one from,
Mm.
but for folks who were in consulting, right? For people who are interested in gaming, for people who are interested in monetization in gaming or switching their actual roles, being in industry, but switching their roles in the industry, what are some like words of wisdom that you would give folks?
Yeah, I think the first thing is when we talk about working on your passion, I think the number one tip I give everybody is don't turn your brain off when engaging with that passion. So, in the lens of games, it's like, yeah, I could probably, play World of Warcraft for, 3 or 4 hours a day and just like be a player. But if I want to
Mm-hmm.
work in that space, I need to think about what is it that keeps me playing 3 or 4 hours a day? Like, what are my goals? What excites me? And because the people who work in those spaces are asking those questions. So if you can
Mm-hmm.
come in to an interview or if you're pivoting within the company, coming to those spaces with answers in mind, and they don't have to be right, it's just your perspective, but it signals like, oh, this person cares deeply and they want to improve it. I think that is a really big first step for people, being able to critically examine their passions and be so invested they want to see other people have that passion too and level it up. So I think there's like an intention piece to it. I think if we're talking about pivots, either from outside the industry, that makes a lot of sense. Hey, like, why does this consultant want to work on WoW? It's like, okay, well, I actually think about it all the time. Like that, helps a lot bridge that gap. I got a lot of those questions as well when I was making my pivot.
Yeah.
But I think within games, if you're looking to pivot, between roles or disciplines, finding someone that you can talk to in those spaces. And I had this conversation with a coworker the other day about, oh, like, I had someone asking me about, moving into engineering. I forget if that was the actual example, but making sure that's where you want to go, like doing
Yeah.
your research. If you say like, oh, I want to write code, it's like, do you really understand what comes with that? Like, do you
Mm.
want to be, fixing bugs and doing all this, like whatever like the role entails? making sure you have someone in that space to like explain what they do. So you're like, oh, actually, like that's not what I'm passionate about. I thought it was this other thing, and they can point you in the right direction. It kind of goes down to like, again, like figuring out what energizes you and narrowing those bands rather than just throwing a dart at a dartboard and hoping it lands where you want it to.
Right. Awesome. Awesome. Well, there you have it, y'all. Austin, thank you so much for sharing all that wisdom with us, man.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the conversation.
Awesome. Yeah, no, this was really great. This is really good. And thank you all for tuning in. Please remember to like and subscribe for more. Most importantly, pivot powerfully. Be well, everyone.
Take care.